Around 15 years ago, I was working at a plant and we had just had a small fire or something else that I needed to tend to. I can't remember exactly, but it was something along those lines. Anyways, it was a dumpster fire regardless. When the whole thing was done, the safety manager caught me in the hallway and told me that I reminded him of Putty. You know that character played by Patrick Warburton? This guy dated Elaine in that little sitcom you might have heard of named Seinfeld. You know, at first I was pissed. I wondered why the hell would he say something like that? Putty? Really? This guy seemed like an idiot. Is that really what this safety manager thought of me? Or was it because I was tall, dark-haired, and have a deep voice? Hell, I don't know. So I asked him, why in the world do I remind you of Putty? And that's when he expressed to me that there really were a couple different qualities. He went on to tell me that when we were in a crisis at the plant, which at that point in time I had just gotten there and it happened way more than it ever should have, that many people looked to me for leadership in those situations. I said, well, okay, but how is that like Putty? So he further went on to say, well, you know when Elaine would be highly irrational on the show and she would break up with him, he would just look at her and say something like, okay, so what do we do next? Yeah, but I'm not sure that's a good thing, I said. And he confirmed that it was. And he went a little bit deeper to tell me that I had a couple qualities that gave me some sort of a calm demeanor in these situations. The conversation went on and he told me that people look to me because I'm calm and I have a next action approach to situations. I didn't overreact, and I knew that everyone knew that we would be okay if we just worked through it. Now, before we get started with this episode, let me introduce myself. I'm Steve Baumgartner, and my mission here today, and the mission of this podcast, is to serve you, the listeners, through providing knowledge and tools around leadership strategies on three primary battlefronts. Now, those battlefronts are simply out in the workplace, in your communities, and most importantly, with your family. Now, let's get to work.
Leaders are not born in a womb. They are forged through heat, pressure, and a whole lot of sweat. The Fire Forged Leader podcast serves the audience through exploring leadership at work, in the community, and with the family, using a practical perspective and real-life experiences from the host, Steve Baumgartner, and his guests in The Forge. Now, it's time to enter the Forge with the Fire Forged Leader.
Before we get this thing kicked off, let me tell you a couple ways that you can really support this show. First, make sure you go and give this show a rating. Second, while you're in there, write a few words in a review to let other people know why you listen to this show. And last but not least, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss out on a single episode. So let's start out with talking about what is really leadership in crisis, right? It can be things like tornadoes, hurricanes, Chernobyl, things like that. But really, what we need to understand is that it's different for everyone and for every place and for the people that you lead. And that's something that we got to be really cognizant of, is that crisis is different for everyone. So let's talk about that in the home. It might be a death in the family. It could be a substantial financial rough spot. Say that you got laid off. You went to a one spouse paycheck every week and you're used to living on two. It might be a decrease in hours or many other things that financially kick us. It could be having teenagers. I mean, let's be real here. Teenagers come with an entire realm of crisis sometimes, especially in today's age. And there's natural disasters. There's all sorts of things. Out in the community, these things look a lot the same as what they do at home. Now at work, it might be an event like what I was talking about, this fire that I had at work. It might also be a change in ownership, and people might go into crisis mode because of the change in ownership and things are changing. It might be the loss of a major customer, or you can't find the right parts or supplies to run your production lines. It could be all sorts of different things. But what we need to do as leaders is to be able to identify and then lead through those crises. Now, some of those things, they might come on very abruptly, and other things may creep in where you have more time. But something that I know about crisis is that we always need to try and prepare the best that we can, but you're not going to catch everything. So to prepare, we might do things like risk assessments and managing through those risks. Knowing about them beforehand, it's definitely a good thing. And how you're gonna work through it is equally important. Building out a team that can respond in a crisis. I work in plants that have anhydrous ammonia. We have to have teams that can respond to that because there's few other people in the world who can. We know more about our plant systems than what the rest of the world does. So having that training and those simulations, they ensure readiness. But what about the times that you can't predict the crisis? We still need to train and we still need to simulate. And that's what I'm going to get into here. When we operate under pressure, there's a few key traits that we must be practicing to be effective in these situations. Despite whether it's at home, work, or out in the community, it doesn't matter. We need to be prepared. The first one is emotional intelligence. All right, you've probably heard your HR department talk about emotional intelligence. But let me tell you what it really is. It's what's inside of us that enables us to manage our emotions. It helps us to recognize the emotional needs of our teams. And that might be the teams at work, it might be your family, whoever you're leading. And it helps us to come to those people with empathy, understanding, and a genuine concern that ultimately if we deal with our emotional intelligence correctly, it will boost the morale and build cohesion within the team. All right, so number one, emotional intelligence, and it's number one for a reason. The next one is decisiveness. As leaders in crisis situations, we need to assess situations rapidly. And I'd even say that we need to do that even in non-crisis. We need to make informed choices. We need to take in a lot of information quickly and make good choices about them. And the last part of decisiveness is we need to be able to act promptly. All right? People look to the leader to be decisive. It's a key trait regardless of whether you're in crisis or not. Communication skills is the third one. We need to be transparent and clear in our communication. Ultimately, what it does is it helps reduce the panic out of this crisis situation if we can calmly, clearly, and have full transparency. Imagine that you're in a mall and someone comes over the loudspeakers, "Run, everybody, run, run!" All right. Everybody goes into panic, right? But if someone gets on the loudspeaker and goes, "Attention, everybody. We have a fire in the west wing of the mall. I need you to proceed to the east wing of the mall and follow the crowd out the double doors to the parking lot where we will assemble. There will be people there to guide you to the door." It just helps everybody reduce that panic level. And it also helps everybody understand their roles and responsibilities in the situation. For that example in the mall, your role is to calmly go to the double doors and you're going to follow the east wing, right? And your role is to listen to the people who are guiding you there. And that calmness, that communication skill, reduces that panic and lets you know that you're going to be all right. The fourth thing that I believe is crucial is adaptability. All right, being able to adapt to the situation. We need to be able to revise plans as needed. We need to adopt new approaches, and we need to be able to pivot. So I'm going to go into 3 different examples here. The first one I'll probably go into a little bit deeper, and then I'm going to give you another 2. 2 of these examples are from my own personal experience, and then one of them is from another gentleman that I met in Joplin. All right, so let's start off with the first story. Last night, Sherry, my wife, and I were driving home from a furniture store that's about 30 miles away from our house. All right, just to let you know, we got a nice leather sofa and a chair, an accent chair, and a nice end table. All right. So as we're driving home, we were having a conversation around death and how people handle it. And the reason for that is because we have something that's very close to us right now that's currently going on. And it was just conversation, about how people handle death, how things need to happen through that cycle, how the family needs to work through certain things, right? People react a lot differently than what they normally are in a situation around death. And as we were having this conversation, my wife thanked me for how I was her rock when her father passed away. Now, to go into that a little bit deeper, I had to stop and think about this, right? I had to stop and think about why she said this to me in the moment. And I know that I lead well in certain situations, but I hadn't recounted this event until this point. So going into it a little bit deeper, we lived about 3 or 4 hours away from her father. And my wife and her father had just really rekindled a relationship after being apart for many years due to, I'm just going to say it bluntly, due to lies that my wife had been told about her father. The things that people do when they grieve, right? Now, my father-in-law died of a very aggressive cancer, and he also died in a hospice bed in his apartment at night with my daughter and my wife there at his side holding his hands. Now, needless to say, my wife was going through a very rough time at this point. You know, her father had just died. She was grieving that as well as grieving the loss of having a father for many, many years over lies that she had just found out about. And she was very emotional. She was in crisis mode. All right, so this was a crisis for my wife. Now, I wasn't going through crisis. I was having a hard time because I hated seeing her like that. I also enjoyed being around her dad a lot. He was a great guy. We had some really fantastic conversation. But, like I said, he was in an apartment. And to be frank, his landlord was a piece of crap. There were deadlines that we needed to get the apartment cleaned up. We needed to get furniture out. We needed to do repairs so that we didn't incur additional costs. There were only a few of us that were going to do it. There was a few siblings that were capable, and my daughter and her siblings. Her sibling, excuse me. And I needed to take the leadership role. It was evident that to be able to meet the mission, that I needed to step into that leadership role. So let's start out with these traits that I talked about. Emotional intelligence being the first one. Like I said, we needed to get things done. We needed to clean out his apartment. There were deadlines to make for the lease. We needed to have furniture pickups, posting things so that people could come pick them up, load them into our vehicles if we were taking them. There was trash pickups. There was, in this town, we had to make a special arrangement for anything big. There was a lot of deadlines. There was a lot of work to do. He had lived in this apartment for like 20 years. I also needed to keep my wife's feelings and emotions in front of me. For me, it's very easy to push very, very hard and get things done. But with my wife's feelings and emotions, especially around this topic, I would have been just piling on pain to my wife through this entire ordeal. I also needed to control my own feelings. I needed to control them so that I didn't get too emotional and have her break down because of it. But I also needed to show enough emotion to show that I cared for her as well as her father. So there's this balance that I had to take as a leader. The balance is getting things done, addressing my wife's emotions properly, and addressing my own emotions properly. Stepping in and being decisive. I'm going to give you an example on this one. There was a dining room table that he used. And I'm going to tell you right now, this thing was not anything special, right? It was just a dining room table. I could have very easily thrown this thing away. It wasn't in great shape. The top was delaminating. He usually kept a tablecloth on it. But to my wife, it was everything. It was his, and there was memories, and nobody wanted it. And granted, this was an emotional based reaction on this table. If we were to see it at an auction or a garage sale or something, she'd say, "What the hell are they trying to sell here?" But it was her dad's, and it was special to her. They had conversations there. My kids did artwork there. All that stuff. She didn't want it to go to the dump. So I had to be decisive. I made a quick decision to strap it into the back of my truck, even though I didn't have the room. And when she tried to talk me out of it, I'm like, "Honey, I can refinish that. And I'm going to repurpose it into that craft table that you've been wanting. I'm going to cut a hole in the top. I'm going to drop it down and put your sewing machine in there so that you can continue to use this table that hosts all these memories from your dad." And I followed through with that. But I had to make these kind of decisions about many things. I also had to make the decision on what and where to slow down. There was sometimes when I was getting very anxious because I didn't think we were going to meet the deadline. But I knew that my wife's aunt, I knew that these other people needed this time for healing. So I had to make those kind of decisions. We need to be decisive in leadership. Communication skills. This should go without saying. If you've listened to any of these podcasts, you're always hearing about communication. But let's talk about it for a minute. So in this situation, I needed to rally a team of highly emotional people that included my father-in-law's siblings and children to get things done. And emotions can be crippling. But there were still these things that need to be done. And if they weren't done on time, there would be costs that we would have had to incur. And most of these people there incur those type of costs. But through that, I needed to communicate with empathy, and I needed to be very clear about that communication and reach each and every person that was there that I was leading to meet the mission of the things that we were trying to do. And it's not easy, but we need to communicate effectively through empathy and understanding and being absolutely clear to each and every one of the people that we lead. And finally, adaptability. Like I mentioned, I had to constantly adapt in this situation. I had to know when I could speed up. All right. So, for example, when we were taking things out of the bathroom, when we were taking things out of his storage room, there was times I could speed up because people weren't as attached to those things. They didn't have memories around those things. But then when we got to his bedroom and his clothing and different things like that, the table, for example, I needed to slow down. I needed to adapt to those situations. There were actually times that we had to stop and we all sat on the stairway while my wife would look at something and talk about those memories. And like I said, it makes me anxious inside. But as a leader, I have to keep status of all of the emotions of my team. The emotions are as much of the mission as the actual mission itself. So we need to adapt to them. So moving on from there, I talked about the issue at work, right? It's the same thing. People, when there's a crisis at work, they have a lot of fears. They worry about their lives and careers and change. So we need to come with our emotional intelligence again, right? I might have those same fears, but I need to put mine towards the side and show them that I can understand theirs too. I need to be able to understand where my employees are at. And then I need to make quick decisions. I need to be decisive. So I'm listening, I'm taking in information, I'm seeing how people are. I make decisions on emotionally stable people as well, talking to these people who might be freaking out. And I might need to dispatch another group of people to go and take care of the fire. And at the same time, I need to communicate effectively to everybody to make sure that they understand the mission. And as new information comes in from this group that I've sent over to take care of the fire, or this group that I've asked to take care of these people, as more information as more information comes in, I need to be able to adapt to that information. So I did tell you that I was going to tell you 2 stories of my own experience and then 1 story of another man's experience. So I wish I could remember the year right now, but in Joplin, Missouri, there was an incredible tornado, and it ripped through the city of Joplin. And if my memory serves me right, it was over 30% of the town was wiped out. The city was wiped out. Over 30%. And I took my family down there to help. Very soon after this tornado ripped through. And one of the first things that we did when we went down there on the first week that we went down there was we were getting all these donations in from all over the world. There was people pouring in diapers and food and this, that, and the other. And I had a truck. So as my family sorted these things as it was coming in, I was out making deliveries with my truck. And I remember the devastation. It looked like a war zone in the place where this tornado had hit. They cleaned a lot of the stuff out of the streets. And there was no street signs. At this point in time, I never used GPS, right? It was probably there. I just didn't use it. But I remember someone had went out and gotten stakes and put, or cardboard boxes and used Sharpie. They did whatever they could to try and make street signs. And navigating around was horrible. Absolutely horrible. Because it was just disaster. And all you had is these little cardboard box or cardboard signs or whatever. Street signs to go by. But I remember there was this old man and his wife, and they were in their 70s. And I needed to bring supplies to them. And when I got to their house, half of their house was gone. And you could only see like the front door. And then you saw this dining room. And there was this table. And I'm talking to this guy. And he had served in wartime. And he was blind. And his wife had a condition where her skin was paper thin. And what he did was he heard the tornado coming. He heard the freight train coming. And he was decisive. And he grabbed his wife and put her under. She would use the walker. He knew he couldn't get her to the basement in time. He moved her under this big oak table. Later that I found out that he built with his own hands. He was decisive. He grabbed her. He took her under there. Did I mention he was blind? So as everything's flying around, he's holding on to her tight, holding on to this table. He's ripping parts of her nightgown off and dressing her wounds and telling her, honey, we're going to be all right. Honey, we're going to be all right. God has us. We're going to be all right. And he communicated well. He had to communicate because he had to keep her from bleeding out. He was putting these tourniquets of nightgown around her body parts. As there's a tornado going through, things are whipping through the air. He had to communicate through that. And as the house is falling down and things are going around and everything else, he had to adapt to that situation all the way through it. And it's the same four things over and over and over again. It's emotional intelligence. He was probably scared as hell, right? But he needed to be there for his wife because he was leading in that moment. He had to be decisive. There was no time to waste. He needed to get her under that table and get her locked down under there to make sure she stayed safe. He needed to communicate effectively with her. She was in panic mode. He needed to lead. He needed to communicate. He needed to let her know that things were going to be all right. And he needed to adapt to the situation all the way through. That story gets me every time I think about it. That man is so amazing to me. And I'm blessed, very, very blessed in my life to have met so many amazing people. Anyways, we always try to prepare for crisis so that we don't have to go through these kind of things without knowledge or skills or what have you. But we don't think about all the crises we can go through. And things are not always within our control. But as leaders, we need to work on these 4 core attributes: emotional intelligence, decisiveness, communication skills, and adaptability. They're not unique to the crisis situation. And we can practice them everywhere. As a leader, though, I would also add that we need to put ourselves in situations that are highly uncomfortable so that we can practice these 4 in those conditions as well. And that's one of the reasons that I practice jiu-jitsu. So with that, leaders, you have come here to listen to a message. But listening is not enough. I need to know what you, as a leader, are going to apply today, this week, this month, and this year. Now remember, when you become a better leader, you also become a better spouse, a better parent, a better coworker, and ultimately that person that other people want to follow.
You have just experienced the heat and pressure of the forge. Remember, words without action are meaningless. Now, after the heat of the forge, shape your thoughts, quench your brain, then put your new tools to use, adding to your leadership. Tune in next week for more lessons from the forge.